who had watched Orpheus and who had seen and envied his power over the herd who surrounded him. For even then there were sheeple. They resolved to imitate him, and having studied these barbarians, they banded together and called themselves their priests. Religion is divine, but its ministers, after all, are men. The idea from the beginning that imperfect men could rule imperfect men is flawed. For alas, sometimes they are demons with the faces and wings of angels. You see, the simplicity of men and the cunning of their priests has destroyed or corrupted all the religions of the world, bar none. For these priests, ladies and gentlemen, taught the people to sacrifice the choicest herbs and flowers. They taught them formulas of prayer and bade them make so many obeisances to the sun and to worship those flowers which opened their leaves when he rose and which closed them as he set. For that great ball of fire that makes its way from dawn to dusk across the sky was seen as the Savior to those who huddled in the cold darkness surrounded by wild beasts of prey. And it was to that sun that they directed their worship as the great symbol in the heaven of the power of God and the source of all life on this earth. For remember, theirs was a worship of nature's God. They composed a language of symbols, which was perhaps necessary in those times, since letters had not been invented, but which perplexed the people and perverted them from the worship of the one God. Those symbols are still used upon the sheeple of the world today. The great herd. Thus, the sun represented the great doctrine of this religion. The moon represented the church, reflecting the pure light of the sun. And the sun and the moon were worshipped as emblems of God. And fire, by the philosophers of fire, as an emblem of the sun. Water, as an emblem of the moon, which by faith reflected the pure light of its master. The serpent represented the full body of the priesthood, the initiates, and was to be worshipped as an emblem of wisdom and eternal youth, since it renews its skin every year. Thus, it periodically casts off all symptoms of old age and begins anew. Reborn, if you will. And the bull, the most vigorous of animals and whose horns resembled those of the crescent moon, was also worshipped. The priests observed the avidity with which the barbarians adored these symbols and increased them. It was a time of great mystery and little understanding of any that was seen around them. To ancient man, the sun was seen to die, and darkness descended around them. It was a time of great danger and cold. And then As if by magic, the sun was reborn each morning and made its way across the sky, where it became old and then died again. And they began to measure their world by the seasons of the sun. And their religion reflected all of this. And religions today, even though denying any connection with this ancient paganism, still reflects this exact religion in its ceremonies and in its holy days. Even to the layout of its churches. To worship the visible is a disease of the soul inherent to all mankind, and the disease which these men could have healed, instead they pandered to. It is true that the first generation of men might have looked upon these merely as the empty symbols of a divine being, but it is also certain that in time the vulgar forgot the God in the emblem and worshipped that which their fathers had only honored, and therefore the symbol became the God. Egypt was the fountainhead of these idolatries, and it was in Egypt that the priests first applied real attributes to the sun and to the moon, whom they called his wife, and sister and mother. The sun became Osiris, the moon became Isis, brother and sister, mother and son, husband and wife. It may perhaps, for those of you who have not heard it, maybe have not been listening to this broadcast for a great period of time, it may perhaps interest you to listen to the very first fable of the world. From the midst of chaos was born Nimrod. And at his birth a voice was heard proclaiming, "The ruler of all the earth is born." And from the same dark and troubled womb were born Semiramis, the queen of light, and the spirit of darkness. This Nimrod traveled over the whole world and civilized its inhabitants and taught them the art of agriculture. And his wife, Semiramis, built the first fortified cities and walls. But on his return, the jealous darkness laid a stratagem for him, and in the midst of a banquet had him slain. He was nailed down in his prison, which cast into the river, floated into the sea, which even in that ancient time was never mentioned, but with marks of detestation. And when Semiramis learned these sad news, she cut off a lock of her hair and put it on her mourning robes and wandered through the whole country in search of the dead body of her husband. Eventually, she found it. By casting a magic spell, a magical intercourse was obtained between Semiramis and the dead Nimrod.